All right, so let's talk about wind and elk. And this is probably, in one way, the most over-discussed topic when it comes to elk hunting. And then in another way, it's probably the most underrated topic that doesn't get dug into deep enough, often enough. And the reason that is most people understand wind and elk and scent at a no shit level, right? In the sense that no shit, you should not get your scent into the wind and have it blow towards the elk. That's pretty obvious. If you've hunted any other species, you'll know that. If you've hunted elk one time and actually interacted with elk, it's very likely that you've run into this, right? So we can figure that out pretty quickly, okay? It doesn't take a whole lot of horsepower to understand that and get that. The thing is that's not where the incremental improvement is for most elk hunters. And this doesn't matter if it's somebody who's just hunted a year or two or if they've been at it for 10 years. The real incremental gain is getting into the head of an elk and understanding how they view scent and smell. Because once you understand that, all of a sudden you're going to see and be able to take advantage of a bunch of opportunities that were probably there in the past and you didn't even realize it. And then also when you're executing your actual tactics, and it doesn't matter if it's ambush hunting, spot and stalk, driving elk, whatever, all the different variations within there. Once you understand this, everything is going to be more effective. And I mean exponentially more effective, because this is their primary sense. And let's dive into that, because you got to understand that component of this. I've been blessed to spend an enormous amount of time around elk of all different spectrums of hunting pressure. And in that, I have been able to insert myself in big groups of elk a lot. And what that does is it gives you a feel of what the elk are dealing with on a day-to-day basis. So elk have phenomenal hearing, they have phenomenal vision. But when you're in there with them a lot, what you realize is there is a ton of noise constantly. Elk are vocalizing to each other all year long. It's a complete fallacy that they're only doing it during the rut. The volume, the intensity, the different vocalizations, yeah, that changes throughout the year. But they vocalize to each other, particularly in any, significant group size, 3, 4, 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 animals. It is constant vocalization back and forth. And then they're loud. They're loud as they move through the woods, and you have to be there to experience this. But when elk are moving casually, they are cracking branches, antlers are hitting trees, they're hitting brush. They're really not giving a shit, right? A lot of people think they take their experience with elk and elk just popping out of nowhere, and they view that as like, oh, elk move through the woods silently. That's generally not the case. Now, when they want to be quiet, a satellite bull who's coming into a calling setup and he doesn't want anybody to know that he's going to pop out of nowhere, yeah, it's pretty easy for him to be quiet because he's trying to be quiet. The same thing, a lot of times, you'll see a couple bulls that are just roaming through the timber. They're trying to be quiet. And yeah, they can be quiet in those situations. However, that's not their, default personality or how they move around this earth. They're loud. And so they are constantly getting audio stimulus, okay? And then on the sight front, they have the same thing. They're a herd animal. They're moving through timber. They're moving through different vegetation. A lot of times they're spread out. They can be spread out over 600-700 yards, these giant groups of cows and calves that all these elk grow up within. And they're depending on picking up movement, not only to protect themselves, but also just seeing other elk. Calves are jumping up. All of a sudden, a cow will just decide to run. There's all this visual stimulation constantly. So I say that not to tell you that elk are always going to be forgiving on those fronts. If you're skylined up on a ridge blatantly, if you're set up in a meadow and you're blatantly in the open where a bull comes to you, you're calling them in and they pop up and they see you, they know exactly what you are, they're not going to forgive that. They're not going to just walk up to you and let you shoot them. But once you become a pretty good hunter and those scenarios are really not a thing, you're being meticulous how you do things, you're always obscuring yourself, just, natural hunting sense, it does become a thing. Because what you're going to find is that on the hearing front and the visual front, elk are actually somewhat untrusting of those senses. A lot of times they second guess themselves, and it has to do with the fact that their whole life those two senses are constantly stimulated, right? Now, the key here is that their scent, they trust 100% of the time, and they use it to back up those other two senses, and they also use it as a force field. So I'll dive into that a little bit here, because that's really the two different ways they use it, and it's defined, right? So one, they use it as a confirmation tool, right? So they hear something, they notice something visually that's not quite right, and they'll immediately go in and confirm it with scent. Elk will do this. If you're an archery hunter and you've been out archery hunting and if you've called in any elk, you've probably noticed this. If you don't do your setups just right, and I'll be brief on this, but a good setup is when an elk expects to see the animal that's making the sound, you, right, in this situation, when they expect to see that animal, you should be killing them. If you're not set up in that way, they're going to immediately check wind because they depend on that sense to give them 100% true answer, all right? So that's how they use confirmation. And the thing is, it's not just calling setups. You'll see this in a lot of other situations. If you're ambushing them in tree stands, any of that stuff. When they come into an area and they notice something's a little bit out of place, anything like that, they'll go to the wind immediately. They'll confirm with the wind. Guys, I've been using onX Maps for almost 2 decades now, hunting, guiding, outfitting. It is the gold standard tool when it comes to mapping software in the hunting world. They've been a huge supporter of my content for multiple years. So if you want to support me and you want to support them, use my code CliffG for 20% off at onxmaps.com. It is an awesome tool that I use all the time when I'm preparing for hunts, and I use it almost every single day in the field. For navigation, knowing unit boundaries, knowing private land boundaries, it is the tool you have to have. The other defined way that you're gonna see elk use the wind is they use it as essentially a tripwire or a force field, right? So they're gonna be doing this pretty much in all facets of their day, right? It could be bedding, feeding, transitioning between the two. They're going to be setting up tripwires that are based on the wind. And I'll get into this more, but pressured elk do it more. And that pressure could be from human hunting pressure, or it could be from wolves, it could be from lions. It doesn't really matter. If they're getting hunted more, you'll see them do this more and more, right? Everywhere they go, they're going to be protected by their sense of smell. All right, so let's talk about these in the context of the different ways we're going to hunt elk, and I think it'll even, kind of clarify it even more, right? So when we're talking about ambush hunting, calling in elk to setups, that sort of thing, I already mentioned that elk a lot of times are going to confirm with the wind. What they heard, what they hear, something mysterious about where they're going and just different this day, that they've noticed something new. Could be that they see you a little bit. Who knows, right? But they detect something. I mean, they're out there surviving day to day. They're pretty damn good at this. All of a sudden, they're going to go to confirm the wind. Now, in the call-in setup, it's pretty obvious, and everybody talks about this, right? Okay, make sure when you do an elk call-in setup, if the bull decides to confirm the wind, make sure that's to your advantage, that you or the shooter with you can kill the bull when he does that confirmation step. Now, whenever you're ambush hunting in the more traditional sense, like you're sitting on a wallow, you're sitting on a meadow, could be rifle hunting, could be bow hunting, you're sitting on a couple trails that cross, right? You still want to consider if a bull comes in here and he notices something's up. And the exact example that a lot of people run into is they've been sitting there all day, they hear a twig break and they look, and right on the periphery of where they want to shoot, there's a bull standing there looking right at them, right? There's no broadside shot and they've already got you pinned. But they're a distance from you and you've been fairly still. A lot of times in this situation, that animal will either spin aggressively or just kind of mosey off, right? In both those scenarios, there's a good chance. There's a little bit less of a chance if they really barrel out of there, but they'll still do it sometimes. They'll come back and confirm. And if you have preemptively thought about that, you're going to be way better off, because a lot of times what elk do is they spook off, right? Because you didn't quite set up right or whatever, and they come in to check your wind. And a lot of times they do that out of your sight picture, right? So they'll drop off, they'll drop off a ridge a little bit, come back and wind you. But if you've already considered that option and you've put yourself in the mind of an elk and thought, okay, if an elk comes in here and he gets curious and he wants to confirm with the wind, where's he going to end up? figure out your downwind spots, right? Like, where's he gonna pop out? Potentially, sometimes, you know, they're gonna go into cover and you're gonna never see them again and they're gonna get wind, and you'll hear this. A lot of times you'll hear them after you've spooked them once, you know, 5 minutes later on the complete other side of you, you'll hear an elk barrel out of there, right? It's the same elk, it's just confirming the wind and checking just to make sure what they thought was a threat is a threat, right? And they'll barrel out of there. But a lot of times, if you know that and you build that in to your ambush setups, when they come check you, you're gonna get a shot opportunity. It can happen with an archery, it can happen with archery equipment, it can happen with a rifle. I've killed a lot of elk with people because of that very reason. Just sit still and be like, hey, busted us once, he might check us. He might check us and we might have an opportunity to kill him when he does that. That right there is a perfect example of an opportunity that is generally lost and never observed. There are elk hunters that have been hunting for 20, 30 years that don't do that, and they have probably missed dozens of opportunities because of it. They've literally had elk bust them, they get up, pissed, start talking to their hunting partners, whatever, and that elk literally goes out there, gets over there, confirms wind, walks off, and is like, yep, I knew that was not a good deal, right? When if they would have just been consciously thinking about what the elk's gonna do with the wind, they probably could have killed those elk, right? So something that's, you know, seems subtle, but will weigh up your game. Now on the ambush front, when we're talking about like the tripwire way that elk use scent, this is gonna apply more to just like the setup front that doesn't involve calling, because calling tends to be more dynamic. We're setting up, you know, as we move, as the elk move, as we cut them off or whatever. But if you're setting up ambushes on a pattern, a lot of times what people don't realize, and this goes back to more of a traditional view of how elk use scent, but they will go into an area as they scout it out. There'll be a bunch of sign in there, and they'll be in there at that time, and they'll go, oh, the wind's perfect. I can sit on this side of the wallow, and I'll have the wind perfect. I can see by the trail the elk have been coming in this direction, so I'll have the wind perfect. But most likely what'll happen is actually the elk, when they come in, the wind's different, right? So a lot of times you'll be sitting there and you'll be sitting there for hours and hours on this perfect ambush. And then the minute the wind changes, you know, based on a thermal or whatever, that's when the elk show up and they wind you and they leave. And a lot of times in those scenarios, they've set up that tripwire. This is the case on water a lot of time. They've kind of set up that tripwire in a way that you're never even gonna see them. You're never even gonna notice they came in there. So a lot of guys sit on ambushes and they have zero luck because they're not taking into account that if it's a part of the elk's pattern, they are probably busting you with this tripwire use of scent way before you even observe that they're planning on doing that same pattern that you've planned out in your mind, right? All right, so as you get into spot and stalk hunting, still hunting, you kind of get away from the elk's use of confirmation because now you're the one approaching them. Either you know they're there in the classic spot and stalk sense, or if you're still hunting, you hope they're there, right? So in those cases, you're really gonna deal with primarily the force field / tripwire use of the wind that the elk are doing. Now I'll give you the classic scenario as an example, and I think it'll pound in how this plays out in actual hunting scenarios. So I used to observe this a lot because when I was outfitting, I hunted these gigantic drainages. I'm talking drainages that are 3 miles wide, right? So I would be on one side, I would have, you know, a camp full of hunters, and then I could glass across this drainage and I could watch other hunters. Heavily hunted area. If I wanted to glass up other hunters, I could do it every day. And then hopefully most days I was also glassing up elk. So I saw this exchange and, you know, people moving in on elk constantly. I was able to observe that. And the classic move is that guys are going out scouting. They're finding a bench that's a feeding area or whatever. Tons of fresh sign, right? Slimy green elk shit, smells like elk. The elk are right there, but they're always missing them. And elk in the wilderness areas, in the heavily pressured areas, they do become fairly nocturnal, but a lot of times people actually think they're more nocturnal than they actually are because of this dynamic, right? They're seeing that fresh sign, they go, hey, we've come up here, we're coming up here every day, we're not running into them, and we can see, 800 yards ahead of us, 700 yards ahead of us. How could we not be at least seeing them? They've got to just be coming at night, right? Well, I observe this a bunch. What it is when elk are in a susceptible area, so they can be in the wide open in a public land hunting scenario with over-the-counter tags. I would say that, they're very exposed in that situation if they're in the wide open, but they'll be in the wide open. They know what hunting pressure is. They know they've been getting harassed for the last month or whatever, and they're still in the wide open. But when they do that, almost always, there will be like one path in there, and those elk know about that path, and they know it's a predator corridor, they know it's a hunter corridor, and it could be 700, 800, 1,000 yards away. And when hunters hit that, immediately those elk are gone because they're using it as a tripwire, right? They've set themselves up in that feeding area in a way that they know when hunters hit that entry point, they're out of there. And I've seen this time and time again. Guys approach with a bad wind, and sometimes the guys are smart, right? Because they're assuming, hey, by the time we get there, that thermal will change, it'll be going up and we'll be protected. But right now we got to deal with, what we're dealing with because we've got to get closer, right? And they think it's fine because it's a distance thing, right? We're still 1,000 yards away. We're still 800 yards away. Well, in these scenarios where elk are depending on that tripwire to defend themselves, and this is really common in heavily pressured areas because they still got to get out and feed, particularly as it gets cold, as it gets to be more snow, they just have limited options. But what you'll see is those hunters, they get on that trail and immediately those elk are out of there, and they're just using that tripwire concept. And they'll fool people day after day after day, and they'll be just living in that spot, but there's no way, or at least it seems like there's no way to get in there and actually run into them. But if you consider that dynamic, right? If you consider, hey, it's not that they're nocturnal and they're only coming out in the dark. It's that they keep busting us from 800 yards away. Once you know that, you can change your strategy, right? Like you could get up somewhere and glass them. You can approach them from a miserably difficult way and all of a sudden start killing them. That's a way underutilized tactic. Most of the time, the intuitive way to get to elk is the wrong way because of this exact dynamic, right? They know how people, go in there and threaten them when they're in certain positions. You have to remember these elk are using the same historical spots over and over and over and over again. Their moms showed them how they feed in this area. Elk are not geniuses, and they're not having discussions with their loved ones about, how this historical spot is susceptible. But it goes back to that, that pinball analogy. Just by trial and error, these groups of elk figure out what works, and they know, hey, we can feed in this area, and we're going to detect predators, 20 minutes before they get here. So it's perfectly fine we're in the wide open, even though we're surrounded by dudes with rifles, because in this particular area, we don't get screwed with because we always smell them first and we get the hell out of here. So that whole dynamic is very important to understand because it'll play in to all your strategies, and you just get better at killing those type of elk that are in that type of situation. I do very few endorsement deals, and I do no paid reviews because it would affect the type of content, quality of the knowledge I could put out. So an important part of my business model is my membership group. There's paid and free options. I do a weekly live stream there. There is a thriving community of folks that are helping everybody become a better outdoorsman. It doesn't matter if you're a beginner or if you're an expert, there's something there for you. Go join, guys. It helps me out a ton. It's the way to support this content and to support me. I'll see you there. All the info is at pwchuntsquad.com. This kind of brings me back to the more ambush style hunting because I didn't really mention it when I was on that topic. But a lot of people view that as a close quarters thing, right? Like scent is relevant in a close quarter sense. But I have had multiple situations where elk are moving in the wide open and I can watch them from, 2 miles away. I'll watch them for multiple days. And a lot of times this is on property lines, right? Because they're moving from private to public and they're working that property line. Maybe they're bedding on public, for instance, right? Which tends to be the case just due to the topography and vegetation and all of that. But they're moving from feeding areas on private to bedding areas on public. And they'll do the same thing every day. And we're rifle hunting. and there's a little perfect knob that puts you 400 yards away from where they go, right? The thing is, it's back to this whole concept. You go up there and think, oh, I'm going to ambush them from that point. I'll be on the public. The minute they go onto the public, I'll have a shot. And when you go do that, that day, all of a sudden they do something different. They make a sharp turn and they go somewhere else. And you think to yourself, wow, I just got unlucky. It has nothing to do with that. Back to the pinball analogy and using wind as a tripwire. Almost certainly in those situations, what you'll realize is that they are protected by a prevailing wind. And that's why they're going that route. Because other people have seen the susceptibility, they've tried to take advantage of it, and the elk have realized that, hey, if we go this way, we're not getting killed as much, right? And then if we go that way, it's not that they know they're getting killed. It knows that something crazy disruptive happens if they go that way and they're not protected by scent. So they find a pathway where it's like, hey, if we take this path all the time, we get early detection, even during rifle season, we make a turn, and we still don't get our morning ruined, right? So that's what you'll run into. It applies to long distance stuff also. And for whatever reason, a lot of times that is a prevailing wind situation. And I think it's because, just they iterate on it very quickly and they realize like, hey, this path, we're getting early detection of predators. On these other paths, we don't. So they default to those paths where they have those wind tripwires that just keep them alive and keep them unmolested. All right, so wind and scent as it relates to driving elk. So here we have to adjust our definitions a little bit so everybody understands. It's not really adjusting the definition. I think it's more just understanding the perspective. So yes, there's, literally the driving setups that a lot of people think about when they think about driving elk. But you have to understand that a lot of times we run into elk that are bumping off of pressure that act just like driven elk too. So this is a scenario that you run into a lot of times. I used to run into this a lot when I was packing. The elk hunting could be really tough, and all of a sudden I'd run into a DIY public land guy who's got a giant bull dead right on the trail. And he can't believe what happened, right? And a lot of times it was like a close quarter situation. Could be with his bow. He's walking down the trail. Elk pops out right in front of him. He gets a 30-yard shot with his bow. I've seen that. I've seen guys shoot elk from 40 yards with their rifle during, a horrible condition, tough hunting second season, right? On an over-the-counter tag. And they're like, I can't believe this happened. Well, what it is those elk were driven, right? And they were not purposely driven, but pressure drove them there. And what happens when elk get driven, their focus goes away from hearing, goes away from visual, and even goes away from scent, and they think about hauling ass through the exit points, right? All of a sudden their mind is just defaulting to, how do I get out of this situation? What's the saddle I'm gonna run to? What's the timber that I gotta get to right now? Where do I gotta go in order to avoid something really bad happening? This is the one scenario where elk will all of a sudden ignore their scent to some extent. Now, if you're 200 yards away from them and a thermal's running your scent directly to them and they're hauling ass, yeah, they're gonna veer away from you on that scent. But outside of that type of situation, elk can pop out of nowhere when they've got pressure on them, right? So a lot of the times when people run into these weird scenarios where they're like, oh, the wind was just, right at my back, but the elk just showed up right in front of me, almost all the time that is driven elk that they don't know were driven. But this whole dynamic is also what makes driving elk and understanding how, pressure pushes elk around, particularly in the rifle seasons, how all of a sudden it can be very effective because you're taking away one of the tools that they are most dependent on. You're taking away, essentially their ability to confirm and their ability to use a force field, right? So within that context, it makes sense that in certain scenarios when you can do it, all of a sudden that strategy can be super effective because you're stealing what the elk has for defenses, right? So I just got to comment on that because I think there's a perception out there of experiences that people think are elk being dumb when that's not the case. Those elk are just put into this situation where they're either overtly being driven or they're just being driven off other hunting pressure, and people get great opportunities because of that. And it relates to this dynamic with the wind and scent and elk having to give that up in those situations. All right, so the last general thing that I got to talk about before we dive into the nitty gritty of how mountain winds work, thermals, prevailing winds, all of that good stuff, spots that elk choose based on the wind, all of those details. I have to mention that wind and scent still is like a sensitivity spectrum for elk. And I think that in the past, I haven't said this, and it's a little bit of an injustice to people because elk do use the wind and scent a little bit based on how much pressure there's in the area, right? So if it's a heavily hunted area, let's say we're in the flat tops, over the counter tags for 2 months or whatever, 3 months, in those situations, when elk get the scent, they're rolling and they're going to roll for a long distance. If an elk wins you in a calling setup and he's confirmed with the wind that you are what you are, he may not stop running for 1,000 yards. Okay, he knows the situation, he's out of there. Now, when you go to a private ranch that maybe, 2 bulls get killed on a year, 3 bulls get killed on a year, basically an unhunted elk population, say a big ranch, right? A significant ranch, 20, 30, 40,000 acres or something, killing a couple bulls. It's basically irrelevant to the elk's behavior. In those situations, elk, a lot of times, they'll still confirm with the wind. And in this dynamic, you can get into it deeper because a lot of elk on private, they know what real hunting pressure is because they've been on the public. But still, they feel safer on the private, and that's kind of another subject. But what you'll realize is they'll confirm with the wind, and they'll hit you, they'll know what you are, but sometimes they'll just roll 200 yards, 300 yards. And if they need to get where they were going, like there's limited water, if it's the rut and all the cows are over in this other area, all the action's over there, and they got to get by you, a lot of times they'll come back through. They'll come back through you even after they've winded you, right? So there is a spectrum of, just pressure. And this, of course, goes across all the senses. I've seen this with cows, and it's funny to me because I've had situations where I'm in like rut fests and I'll be in like a very, lots of elk vocalizing on public land or whatever. And then an elk wins me and it's boom, gone. They're all gone. And then I've been in rut fests on private ranches and areas that get very little hunting, super high draw tags, that sort of thing. You'll be in rut fest, and usually cows are what wins you, right? They're coming in, and then a group of cows will wind you. They'll perk up, and you'll just hear them run sometimes, or you'll see them run. And in those situations, I can actually use like a comeback call, and I'll show it to you. It's basically calf sounds and then an up and down mew. So kind of intense, right? That call will stop elk that wind you sometimes if they haven't been pressured a lot. Kind of like a ridiculous comeback call, right? Like a duck call, like a comeback call on ducks. And those elk will stop and they'll just think. And they might think for like 10 minutes. And then after 10, 15 minutes, particularly if you're in a swirling wind and they can't get the wind again, they'll start to walk back to where they were going to go, in which case is a lot of times towards you. That's why they winded you in the first place. So that is unique to a low pressure situation, just so you guys know. But there is this spectrum, all right? So hopefully that's an overview of wind, gives you an idea of things. Basically, right off the bat, I'll get into the nitty gritty, but the takeaway here should be, don't just think about the scent and wind thing being my smell should not fly into the elk. You should really think to yourself, in this situation, ambush hunting, spot and stalk hunting, driving elk, how am I going to get in the mind of an elk and be like, hey, in this situation, how, if I was the elk, would I avoid getting killed? Think about that first under the context of the tripwire idea and the confirmation idea, and then use that to your advantage as a hunter. And you're going to get this big incremental bounce of all of a sudden how many opportunities you get and how many opportunities you take advantage of. So let's dive into the nitty gritty of the wind. Guys, the last 30 minutes was pulled directly from my online elk hunting course. You can find the details at pursuitwithcliff.com/elk. It is not cheap, and the reason it's not cheap is because it works and it's based on a giant data set. My years, basically a lifetime of hunting elk as a guide, as an outfitter, seeing a ton of hunters go out in the field, be successful and not be successful, seeing what actually works. There's not another course out there like it. That I can promise you. If you just want to get some more free stuff, check this video out right here, my mini spring bear course. Tons of value in there for you guys that are interested in hunting those bears. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll catch you later.